are able to access self-determination by the forming of the constitution of the alliance on the side is unlikely to be successful. Two arguments that I'm going further in this speech. One, self-determination, and secondly, let's talk about self-determination. Why is democracy good? We think that the formation of the Sahel Alliance exists due to the call-out of the military juntas who usurp power from existing democracies within the states. But secondly, also, we might be charitable here and say that there is a motive or an intent to expunge France from this state because of the mass execution of resources. The conclusion of this framing is that it must be willing to defend that the alliance that exists on the other side of the house is made up of a couple of military governments that a threat to democracy. One, within this place, countries of autocrats, which means that the only feedback mechanism they have is likely to be a continuance of autocracies within this alliance. Secondly, they would to maintain power, so that means that they are likely to want to sustain the legitimacy of this alliance themselves, given that the legitimacy that they have internally within those states is fragile, as well as the legitimacy of the Sahel alliance is also fragile. This means that they are likely to do anything to maintain power for the longest period of time and are unlikely to transition towards democracy. But also, the implication of this framing as well is that this also means that they are likely to be repressive significantly to people. This means that they're likely to throw people in jail. This means that they're likely to intensify ethnic conflict, also the lack of representation is likely to exist. All the comparative, given that within ECOWAS, presumably you also have in democratic states, which also have an incentive to protect their own power and protect themselves, which means that there's a feedback mechanism that exists in order for you to transition into a democracy, even though autocracies might exist under ECOWAS on our side of the house. So there's an incentive to transition because the feedback mechanism to get. But additionally also, this is done through trade that exists under ECOWAS. They have to prove why trade is likely to exist under the Sahel Alliance if they want to rebut these part of the analysis as well. Why is democracy good? We think that the state possesses an immense amount of power over people's lives, state power principle. I think we all heard this from around one, probably possibly up until around 9. But secondly as well, we think that democracy ability for them to be able to actualize their preferences, but not just actualize their preferences in a single way, but actualize their preferences in multiple ways. But additionally as well, this means that people within the Sahel Alliance may not ultimately favor people within Nigeria and Chad, may not ultimately always favor their only preference may not just be to expunge France itself. But additionally, even if their only preference was to expunge France, we think that they might have multiple mechanisms of how you might want to achieve this in itself. And democracy offers people the pathway towards achieving this. Why is it then that the counterfactual secures the right to self-determination as a way to clash directly what we presumably might want to argue? We think there's a larger block that exists within ECOWAS, which means that it's much more easier for you to be able to expunge yourself of these sort of international alliances. It's also likely to be the case, given that these countries within ECOWAS also have a history of colonialism. Multiple countries also enjoyed colonialism. The countries like Benin Republic also enjoyed colonialism from France. So it's likely to be a cohesive agreement to expunge France also within ECOWAS as well. But additionally also, you do have the legitimacy of this body, which is that it's much more likely to be able to stand up to France as well. But finally as well, there's a free trade agreement that you're able to utilize that exists within ECOWAS, and also a bigger block that exists to prevent you from foreign imperialism. Why is democracy sort of the most important thing, and how you should weigh this argument? Given that these communities of these countries exist as pluralistic societies, it means that the continuance of autocracy prevents representation of people, which it is likely to create conflict. Secondly, we think that it gives the most amount of people the right for them to be able to seek self-determination. So what we might be able to say on the way in here is that on their side, only preferences of those autocratic governments and their right to self-determination ahead. We think for the most amount of people, they don't have any right to self-determination. That's the conclusion of this argument. Before I continue closing.
Okay, democracy is only as good as such regions of the world.
Then you have a burden to prove that this autocracy is a group. We already explained why they're likely to be repressive in this argument. Don't understand why you made that point. Why is the state unlikely to be successful? Which means that trade is usually, given that trade is usually dependent on a good rapport with all these West African countries, it's unlikely they're able to trade effectively because you form this alliance as an opposition to ECOWAS. It's unlikely they want to trade with you. Secondly, it's from the intention of the African Union. Note that the ECOWAS exists as a sub-body under the African Union. The existence of a Sahel alliance is in contrast to the African Union, which is in contrast to ECOWAS, which means that the African Union has to make a trade-off within this particular instance. It's unlikely to make a trade-off in the direction of the Sahel alliance, which you already explained is likely to remain autocratic, which will further weaken the legitimacy of the African Union as well. The success of these regions also is a threat to the legitimacy of ECOWAS as a bloc. So it's unwilling to trade with these countries, unwilling to trade with this alliance, and unwilling to provide them benefits. Fourth reason under this, these countries are landlocked, so which means that they're not really viable in terms of being able to sell off their commodities, which means that in the best case scenario on their side, they sell off their resources for extremely low prices, which means that this means that the same exploitation all over again. But additionally, in the worst case scenario, they are unable to sell off their resources because of the immense amount of political backlash that exists against them. But finally as well, we know that there's a tension that exists between these countries and France, which is that there's also an international tension that exists between this alliance as well. But also this means that they're not able to access the African Union and its existing trade agreements, and also international trade agreement that exists as well. This is important because know that the African Union has existing trade networks not only with the West, but also with China increasingly instead of quo. Note that this argument has the following impact. One, on their side, the inability for this democracy, for them to be able to be good in principle and practically, means that people starve and people die on their side of the house. People starve from hunger, not being able to access, certain economic benefits. But also, this is important as well because economic rights is a precondition for you to be able to access your political right. If people are starving, that means it's difficult for them to be able to get democracy that is strong on their side of the house as well. But also makes it easier for the state to be repressive towards them. Secondly, as well, this increases the potential for conflict, which means that even in the case that these democracies are good, because these autocracies are good, because of the fact that they're not representative, but also because of the fact that it's harder for them to collaborate, and especially because of these areas are prone to terrorism, things like ISWAP, things like Boko Haram, is that it's much more likely you're going to have insurgents that are not able to collaborate in order for you to be able to solve it because of this disintegration. This means also it affects other West African countries because the cost of conflict is to refugee migration towards other African countries. This is important as well because these African countries, other West African countries are also fragile in terms of their economies. This intensifies the rivalry between the Sahel Alliance and other West African countries and also makes it much more likely they are only to support them. The way of this argument is that the unlikelihood of success is that there's no buy into this alliance, which is that there are fewer individuals existing for Australia, we can have this new Sahel Alliance. For all of these reasons, incredibly happy to be here.
The leader of opposition to open the case for the opening opposition. Here.
Okay, so am I audible? Okay, I'll give my speech in 3, 2, 1. So firstly, the Prime Minister misses a lot of framing and characterization in today's debate, which I'm going to do properly. But then secondly, he doesn't exercise the burden that they were meant to prove. So what were his arguments around? One, that we need to protect democracy. I don't think that's the most important thing that we even need to prioritize in today's debate. Because firstly, how he justifies democracy is that he wants people to self-actualize. Firstly, we agree that autocracies are popularly disdained, right? But in status quo, democracies have been very frustrating. So they tell you that you are free. As the electorate, you have more power than the government because you choose who should lead over you. Once you give them that power, they don't meet your basic needs. So you're frustrated. I have the freedom. I can protest. But you do all of these things that they say you are free. You at the end of the day. Democracies have largely failed, right? So that our burden is then to prove why autocracies are good. That's not really our burden, but since they ask for it, we are going to show you why, like comparatively, like they want us to do, autocracies are not generally bad. Why? Because it's the Western media that consistently wants to make us believe that all autocracies are bad, and so they will never show you the extent to which certain needs of people in this autocratic system of government are met. So every time you watch a documentary about North Korea, it's always about, oh, maybe people are dying. Anytime they want to talk about a military leader, they'll only say, oh, this person is corrupt. They completely like create a propaganda around autocracy. Why? Because the West wants to protect the ideology of democracy, even to the extent that even if democracy is failing, they want to still defend that democracy. I will give you examples. Saudi Arabians live under an autocratic prince, but people in Nigeria suffer extremely. People in Saudi Arabia will never want to live under a democratic Nigeria because the social contract even works better. Why do they have the incentive to treat their citizens better? One, because they know that people have cracked the code on how to impeach bad governments, even when they're autocratic. We have examples of the Arab Spring, a lot of instances where democratic leaders were. So what these autocracies do is that because they want to preserve power, The social contract looks like this. We'll give you everything you want. We'll make sure you're employed, you're eating well, you have everything you want. Don't just go into the level of politics that will then affect our family at the end of the day. So if it has to do between the comparative of self-actualization and a world where people live a bearable life, we'd rather prefer that autocracy at the end of the day. I'll take you in America. But secondly, they tell you that under ECOWAS, they are able to protect you from imperialism. We think that that is bad because ECOWAS in a whole is very submissive to imperialism at the end of the day. If they wanted to protect you from imperialism for so long, most African countries would have detached themselves from the influence of the West in their economy, in their culture. You will not have issues of America telling you have to accept LGBTQ before we can have certain things with you. Realize that when this kind of things happen, there is never a case study where ECOWAS has for once stood up against imperialism on behalf of their citizens. But then let me show you what is the most important characterization in today's debate. We support something at the point in time when it is not just principally justified, but when it is able to achieve the most positive outcome for stakeholders within the debate. We support the Sahel because it is good and it is profitable. Where is this debate taking place? Firstly, in a continent that is very feeble as a regional bloc. ECOWAS has failed on many grounds. A, they can place sanctions because you have a preference on how your government should run, and they never consider how those sanctions hurt the most vulnerable people, which are poor people within those countries. Secondly, they are very engaged in extracted concessions. So these Sahels are usually the minority. So they do not like something within the ECOWAS and it affects them. They really have no say because bigger countries like Nigeria and the rest would have to inform that there was actually a concession for certain decisions, even when it disadvantages them. But thirdly, they hate revolutionary ideas. So they know that in many instances, a different form of government is likely to work, but they want to align with the West and the democracies because they want to gain some benefits from them. We think this is bad. But let's also characterize what the Sahel looks like. The Sahel countries are countries that have their own dreams, their own preferences, their own picture of what they want their countries to look like. But they are like that submissive wife that wants to be subject to their husbands or the bigger family goals, even when it is detrimental to them at the end of the day. So we think that also these Sahel regions are colonized by France. France still has a direct policy on these people, control their monetary policies, and it's too obvious that the influence of France has stifled the growth of these countries for so long. In ECOWAS, they will never really be able to have like their autonomy to be free at the end of the day. It then means that an important clash in today's debate has to be this. Is it better for these countries to pursue their own form of self-actualization or become the loyal countries that want to keep the family of the ECOWAS together while being internally torn apart and impoverished at the end of the day? Do not let anybody in this debate tell you that the clash is beyond this. We need to defend a world where regional blocs should act like they need to do. And secondly, if people deserve a free form of self-actualization at the end of the day. So an analogy is this: if I belong to a family, even though we are connected by blood, if I feel disadvantaged, I have the right to live. Principally and practically, that benefits me at the end of the day because I'm then able to join another association that gives me the utility that I want. But we also think that on impact, firstly, it makes ECOWAS to be incentivized to be able to carry on their goals if they do not want unity to stop. So if ECOWAS wants unity, then they need to be stand up against imperialism. Why? Because if they start successfully, like as countries that feel disadvantaged within the ECOWAS would also want to. ECOWAS will not want this kind of things to happen, so they are now incentivized to wake up and say the revolution that we are opposing the Sahel for. Let's consider it. Let's still get it in ECOWAS. Let's make countries believe that the benefits they want can still exist at the end of the day. But we also think that the reason why we support the Sahel is because they have the right to have an association outside of the body that hampers on their choice for state operations. If you want to run a military system of government, run it at the end of the day. If you want to break away from France and their imperialist MMPs, we will think that you need to break away at the end of the day. We think that secondly, these people also have the right because most times they are not largely considered in economic policies by the ECOWAS. The reason why this is true is because if the ECOWAS wants to take certain decisions, they have to consider the fact that they really want to still have the support of the West economically. They want to align with their values. These countries hate it. Let them form their own association. Let them define their value. It also means that they will still have stakeholders that will support their economic growth because this Sahel cannot decide this is the ally we like. They have hated France for a long time. time, but they have been forced to still be allies with France at the end of the day. When they form their own association, they're able to connect with people that can help their economic growth, help them achieve stability. But even if you say they'll become unstable or citizens will suffer, it's only going to be for a while, because at the point in time when you take revolutionary decisions, it's to make you unstable. But eventually, these citizens will get the benefit of the basic things that they want. They'll be happy that they're no longer tied to values that they inherently dislike at the end of the day. We don't just need to prioritize ECOWAS, we need to prioritize vis-a-vis Sahel and how it impacts on ECOWAS attitude towards regional blocs at the end of the day. I have never been more proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We call on the Deputy Prime Minister to close out the case for the opening government hearing. Eze, hold on please.
I'm really getting tired of optimism in this parliament, not listening to nuanced analysis and just simply trying to respond with one-liners. When you say that democracies have failed, you have to be comparative. You have to argue that the autocracy that you support on your side is likely going to be more benevolent. You can't just say because democracies aren't that perfect in West Africa, therefore any autocracy is likely going to be good. I'm going to respond to this with 4 reasons. One, if you consider democracy is globally popular, you need to engage our clash on the unlikelihood of success when you are a small region with an unpopular system of government, because you already consider it's unpopular. So even if you maintain the facade of a democracy, this gives you the validation of external countries. Likely to succeed on our side, even if that democracy is failing. Don't just win the debate. Secondly, Saudi Arabia is not a good example. Saudi Arabia has oil. There's a Middle East. You are not. It's easy to ignore you. It's not easy to ignore Saudi Arabia. You can't just copy paste examples and expect to win. Thirdly, this is not even a benevolent dictatorship. Libya was. People were not trying to leave Libya. People were not scrambling to leave. But like Nigerians are like the biggest space of democracy or the biggest space demography within West Africa. Like we have a lot of Niger Republic refugees living right now in northern Nigeria. They live in IDP camps, basically because they are running away from their countries. If they were such a benevolent dictatorship, people would stay back as they did for Libya and as Gaddafi's, Libya was successful. But fourthly, even if this is a benevolent dictatorship, every benevolent dictatorship needs regional validation. The reason why Libya was able to succeed under Gaddafi is because the entirety of Africa loved Libya. They loved Gaddafi, and it was easy for other countries or other presidents to try and collaborate with him. We already proved to you, giving a lot of mechanizations as to why people already hate this guy. People in West Africa already hate the new governments are forming. People everywhere else in the world, because we seem to be anti-Western. You do not have any support whatsoever. You can't simply say democracies are failed, therefore the alternative is always going to be better. Be nuanced. Second piece of response. They say ECOWAS is bad for them because they don't get listened to. Again, real lie. Anybody who listens or who follows the news knows this is a lie. Nigeria has been the biggest supporter of Niger Republic. Nigeria opened these borders to their refugees. Nigeria literally is building like a highway. Niger Republic, with the high support of the region, they have not been in times past. The only reason why there was a need for them to secede away from ECOWAS is because it's not because they kicked out France. Everybody liked that. To be very clear, we like the fact that they kicked out France, but ECOWAS pressured them to go back to the democracy, like to hand over power. That's how cool it should be. When you challenge like an authority that is bad, after a few period of time, you should have an election and go back to democracy. These leaders refused to transition back to democracy. That was why ECOWAS fell out with them. Not because they kicked out France. We like that, but we don't like the fact that they refused to transition back into a democracy. Then let's talk about like the I think that's all in terms of the NPRs. No. Okay, so let's talk about like why we win on this side. It's like a class that isn't engaged. We give you analysis on the nature of this region or the nature of this like alliance that has been formed. One is that the region is incredibly landlocked. These guys are literally living in the desert, right? It means that you cannot again argue that they're likely to be economically dependent on each other because there's no comparative advantage that they have on each other. Most of them are resource-rich, like areas that simply mean that they can't trade with each other. Like the gold that you have in Chad Republic, for example, is not necessary for people living in Niger. What it means that the kind of trade you need has to be external to West African countries or with other countries around the world. The only way you're able to get that on their side is if you incredibly devalue those resources, which means that your economy is likely going to fail because you're literally trying to beg people to come and buy from you and not place sanctions on you in that instance. So if you devalue that, that's not good for your economy. But we still argue that because you don't have a competitive advantage, everything you have within the Sahel region, every other country in West Africa has it. Like the gold you have there, you have that in Ivory Coast or in Ghana. The oil that you have in Chad Republic, you have more of it in Nigeria. There is really no competitive advantage that they have that makes them uniquely important to the world. So it's very easy to ignore them. Secondly, is that they are plagued by insecurities. Like literally, Chad is the headquarters of the Islamic State, ISIS of West Africa. They're called ISWA and Boko Haram. Literally, these guys literally have like headquarters of like regional insecurity or like terrorist organizations. What it ultimately means is that you need a cohesive collaboration between other countries to help you fight this insecurity. You cannot do that alone. Ultimately, also, when they already concede by their analysis that because they kicked out France, there is reason for the Western forces to actually show that they failed. So everybody really wants to see you fail so that they can prove that your existence actually was not supposed to be there in the first instance. Thirdly, is that they are anti-Western, so they are hated by the rest of the West. Again, we don't have to
defend France. What we simply say is that because you already formed a situation where you are being anti-Western, and you are now also doing like a system that's undemocratic, it means everyone else who is an ally of the West is unlikely to want to support you in that instance. This proves why you are unable to get significant trade. It proves why your economy is likely to crumble. This then means that when your economy crumbles, the spillover effect is the impact that you get from summer, because the spillover effect is that you have more like refugee crisis in the region, which affects everyone else. This is not an actor motion. So when you're affecting everyone else, it is legitimate for us to argue that we oppose this creation, because the creation of this state is likely to affect all of us. We already have the refugee crisis in our hands in West Africa. You exacerbate that on your side. Thirdly, is that you are, or fourthly, is that you are anti-ECOWAS. This means that they are unwilling to trade with. Literally 2 years ago, there was a formation of the AFCFTA, right? People needed to be a part of their regional bodies to sign up to the AFCFTA, which is the like Africa Free Trade Area. When you pull out of this region, you pull out of that trade area, which means that it becomes significantly harder for businesses within your region to do business with other people. It means that you have to pay tariffs. It means that you have to struggle to actually export or import things within your region. This again proves our case on the unviability of the success of these guys. Lastly, is that this means that there exists political will for ECOWAS countries to try and frustrate your success. Because you are surrounded by all the people that hate you, you're likely also going to become a scapegoat for these, individuals. What did someone tell you that wasn't responded to? There's a reason why they don't have POIs, they agree with us. Someone tells you a number of things. Firstly, that democracies in themselves ultimately have a good for the people. Guys, it's 6:30. That democracies ultimately have like the tool for people to want to be able to. We might agree that democracies in West Africa are not perfect, but we concede that you have to comparative and argue that your side actually benefits these individuals, considering the fact that there's evidence that they already do not like this in this instance, given the fact that there's mass, exodus from these regions, people are literally, immigrating from this region. The impact of this, therefore, is that you're likely to have increased starvation and hunger for the people, because now it's not only that you are running a bad government, but that others are unwilling to help them in a way that elevates their economic standing. The way here is simple. There is no buying for this alliance, which means that people are likely going to suffer more on the ground than they are already doing in this instance. For all of these reasons, we should be in the finals.
Well, thank you very much for that speech. We invite the member of government, the deputy leader of opposition, to close out the case for the opposing opposition. Right here.
Now, so the first thing I'm going to take out from this moment is the idea that we have to defend democracy. First of all, this is not an actor motion. So we cannot be defending democracy. It's an opposed motion. So we have to show the benefits for the Sahel states. If democracy doesn't benefit them, there is no incentive for us in this debate to continue defending democracy. We need to prove exactly why the Sahel states should stay in the economic bloc of West Africa, so that they can achieve democracy, and how democracy is going to continuously benefit them. We don't think that that's our burden in this debate. But then what am I going to take out first of all from their case? They talk about trade. So a couple of responses to this. They say that countries in the ECOWAS will not want to trade with them, other people will not want to trade with them. But the idea here is simple, right? There are other states in Africa. The economic ECOWAS is not the only regional bloc. There's still North African bloc, but even bigger than that, right? We have other countries, Russia, China, that will be willing to accept these people's ideologies because they are kicking out the West. The idea is too simple for it to be misunderstood this way. ECOWAS is not the only bloc that would want to trade them, but then they even contradict themselves by saying that these people do not have any resources. So when they stay in ECOWAS, what then is their benefit if they cannot trade with people that are within that bloc? You say that Nigeria has oil, Chad has oil. So of course, Nigeria being the bigger reserve would definitely dominate the space. So Chad has nothing to even trade with in ECOWAS. We don't think that can be the biggest clash. So let's also take out their idea on democracy. So no, explains to you why democracy cannot be the biggest burden for us to defend, right? A lot of democracies are already failing. If these people are not benefiting from democratic systems, they tell us that autocratic regions or autocratic are not likely to succeed. But here's the thing, we already gave you a lot of examples on why, Russia, Saudi Arabia, all these people that have autocratic governments are going to succeed. But then what did they say? That people are going to backlash against them and things like that. But Burkina Faso had this guy, Traore, who is 6 years old. guy. So even if you say that, oh, people are not going to want to associate with them because they are autocratic systems, we think that the people in that country are going to be satisfied. Why? Because they're not living under failed democracies where you can exercise your rights, but at the end of the day, you don't have anything that is good for you. But even beyond that, right, why do these autocratic systems benefit these people more? Because these people have the incentive to want to stay in government for a longer period of time. So you cannot come and argue that these autocratic systems are going to like suppress human rights. All these things still happen on your side of the world, and comparatively, it is worse for you because you tell people that they have to freedom, they have to rights, but at the end of the day, you don't still give them their basic human needs. Why then do we win from opposition? We tell you exactly why the Sahel states are likely to succeed. These people have their own ideologies, they have the things that they want to do for themselves. We think that principally, first of all, it's important that these people are allowed the right to self-actualize. You cannot tell them that they cannot leave ECOWAS simply because the economic state or the AU is going to be angry with them. These people cannot continue to like stay in a system that doesn't benefit them when there are other alternatives that they should explore. You say that these people are unlikely to succeed. We say that first of all, you actually need to even give them a chance to see if they will even succeed or not. But then even if you say that they're not still going to succeed, let's show you why. These people, first of all, have kicked out the imperial power that has been holding them back for a long number of years, right? This, like France basically has been controlling these people's resources over and over again. They've been exploited. We're showing you exactly why, because they have taken this stance, this hard stance to kick out France. It's more likely that they will even get more buy-ins from other powers that oppose the Western powers, i.e. Russia, China. These people want them to continue buying into the ideology that you do not need democracies to survive. So at the end of the day, these people are going to like want to be with them. I'll take you.
The existence of the Africa-Europe Summit, Africa-China Summit, Africa-Russia Summit proves that Africa plays as a bloc. When you come out of these regions, it is difficult for you to do anything without the protection of the African Union.
No, so you see, the idea is not that you cannot trade with other people just because you pull out from the African Union. There are other blocs that exist. The Sahel regions have the ability and the capacity, and they deserve the right to be able to exist independently of things that hold them back from self-actualize. That cannot be the debate. So then let's talk about why it is beneficial for Africa beyond just ECOWAS, right? At the end of the day, what we show you is that these people are going to become self-reliant at the end of the day, right? So things like them being able to trade independently, them not having to be overshadowed by the bigger powers in the economic states like Nigeria, Ghana, all these bigger powers that don't allow them to even like achieve what they want, because at the end of the day, these bigger countries will always dominate them when it comes to like decision making and things like that. But we think happens on our side of the world is that you give these countries the ability to have their own union, because these people have similar ideologies, they have similar things that they want to achieve that is very different from majority of the other states in the economic community. So what you do is show them that they can be self-reliant. How does this impact the rest of Africa? We think that at the end of the day, other African states that even want to pull out of ECOWAS will most likely do this. And why is this a good thing? We then incentivize ECOWAS to step up its game. Because at the end of the day, the ECOWAS has been largely failing, a whole lot of inefficiencies in the states. But at the end of the day, when you show that these people can be self-reliant on their own, they create their own bloc, you then tell other states that if ECOWAS is not succeeding, you can easily pull out. You think that that runs better at the end of the day for all stakeholders involved. What then do we show you? We show you exactly why, first of all, self-reliance is very important for these Sahel states. You cannot deny them the right to be able to self-actualize just because democracy is a thing. The idea that democracy is the most important thing in this debate is very flawed, because what happens is that these Western powers all want you to believe that democracy is the best thing since sliced bread, but we don't think that that's the idea. That cannot be the main idea in today's debate. If these states have the power to self-actualize, regardless of whether democracy is the most important thing to the West or to other communities in the ECOWAS, we don't think that that can be what is most beneficial for the Sahel states. If the Sahel states are able to self-actualize without democracy, we think that is best for the people that live in that region. What then do we tell you? What's the benefits for these Sahel states? States like Mali, Burkina Faso, etc. are going to then be able to like have their own rights, things like have their own like self-realize and all those types of things. We prove to you a number of things in today's debate. We show you exactly why trade is still going to happen, because AU is not like the ultimate, right? Other states are going to want to collaborate with these people. There are other unions that exist. This is not the ultimate power. We show you exactly why democracy cannot be, because even if you say that democracy is the most important thing, there's no transition back to democracy at the end of the day. Autocracies come to there's no guarantee that these things will not end at the end of the day. But even if they take some time to before they end, we think that that's still good, because most of the time the popular people, the leaders in this place are backed up by popular votes. So even if it takes a whole lot of years before they can transition to democracy, we think it's still good as long as they achieve the benefits that these people are going to get at the end of the day. We show you exactly why open opposition wins.
Thank you very much for that speech. Of government to open up the case for a closing government. Yeah.
So am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, so shout out to Mercy. It's been amazing partnering you for bands. It's been an awesome experience. Shout out to Takura and Smart. They're amazing people. So I shall start my speech. Okay, so I shall start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There is something that has largely been ignored in the remaining half. The Sahel region is constantly in fights. Why? Because of the economic disparities that exist within these spaces. We think the internal fights in these particular places are so much worse. These guys tell you, look, let's pursue our dreams. Let's pull out from ECOWAS because we do not want to have a toxic man. The alternative then is we will trade with Russia. I think that's quite unclear, or like that's quite like to argue in this debate. How do we think this pulling out works? We think this is like this Sahel region, like necessarily pulling out of ECOWAS and signing into, like, that Sahel alliance. The debate then becomes which alliance is the better alliance for these Sahel regions and that sort of thing. Opening half necessarily argues about autocracies and democracies and that sort of chat. We think the debate does not exist within whether it's going to be democratic, autocratic, and that sort of thing. We think the debate is about the economic benefit or like the way they're able to emancipate themselves from like economic disparities. We think that's where the debate largely happens, and that's what we're going to do for you from CG. The first thing here then becomes in terms of like the protection mechanism that exists. We think at a point in time, these Sahel regions, Sahel countries necessarily pull out. We think largely, they're going to have some sort of economic disparities. I already tell you my characterization. There's so many fights already going on within the Sahel region because of how they're very disparate and that sort of thing in terms of economy. But if that is now, you remove the only thing that protects them and that sort of thing. Why do we think this is going to get worse and that sort of thing? We think polarization already happens within these states and that sort of thing. We think that's much more worse when they pull out from the only person or like from the only trade blocks that exist. Why do we think this is true? You have now been exposed to the international market. You cannot make trades and that sort of chat. Why do we think this is true? You're not able even to negotiate. Your bargaining power is necessarily way too low. We think that's bad. But the second thing here is on why these economic shocks are largely going to affect you as the countries. We think you do not have collective support and that sort of thing. But the second thing here is that now you're exposed to commodity price volatility, but also external downturns. These are things that harm you so much more. Like this debate happens where we have like precedent information. But at the point in time UK left these spaces, their currency devalued. These guys cannot come and tell you it's likely that it's gonna be information that it didn't work. Why it's so much worse is that these are developers already economically disenfranchised and that sort of thing. We think it's so much for these guys. If they want to follow their dreams, let them follow their dreams after they already probably grow or develop and that sort of thing. We think that's very important. But the impact here is then you lack solidarity and that sort of thing. We think you undermine the long-term sustainability. All already tells you We are willing to trade off the short-termistic sustainability. Now here is why this is worse. A, you are already at a disadvantage. What it then means now, you are more disadvantaged, and the intensity of harm here is far much more worse. If they want long-term impact, we think the comparative here or the weighing here is that the intensity of harm that happens within that time of exchange is particularly very bad. Four things then you need to do when you're trying to oppose. A, we think if it's ineffective. B, we think if it's unnecessary or unjustified. Or C, we think if it's counterproductive. Why do we think then this is very ineffective? A, you do not have capacity. These countries are the minority countries within the Western region. We think at that particular point, their capacity is largely hindered from them to even make trade and that sort of thing. But secondly, they have no money, or they don't have more money compared to how the ECOWAS has and that sort of thing. But the third thing here is on the establishment of ECOWAS. ECOWAS is already established, which then means that more countries are willing to trade with ECOWAS and that sort of thing. These guys cannot come and argue that you're going to get so much success and that sort of thing within that bank. But why do we think then it's not? I think this leaving of ECOWAS is necessary. Military coups and that sort of thing. Why do we think this is bad? We think this dictatorship within African countries, we think that's bad for these people and that sort of thing. The next thing here then becomes on economic isolation and why we think that's bad. The characterization we already give to you is that these people are necessarily very poor, suffering and that sort of thing. ECOWAS is their only protection mechanism. Why? They have significant economic blocks and they have sustainable GDP. What it then means is that you diminish your opportunities to trade and invest with other countries. They tell you that you have alternatives like Africa and Russia. Here is why those alternatives do not work and why we think those alternatives are bad, exclusive from CG. A, the alternative that they give you is Russia and that sort of thing. We think Russia as an actor is not benevolent. If they tell you that Russia is going to trade with you nicely and that sort of thing, they need to prove to you that Russia has your best. That's true, because Russia wants to maintain a superpower and that sort of thing. Is that you create a lot of superpower struggle within these places. But the other thing here is pulled out of ECOWAS, which then means you cannot go back. Why do we think this is bad? You are now likely to be exploited by the Russians because now they know you have nowhere to fall back and that sort of thing. We think that's bad for you. You're likely going to sell your goods and price and whatever at lower prices, and that is very unsustainable for you as an alliance. But the second thing here is on how you're able to get backlash from African countries. Why do we think this is true? We think a lot of African reforms, or how Africa is necessarily moving, is that people are necessarily creating a unified Africa. At the point in time, these countries actively want to pull out and seclude themselves from Africa. We think more African countries are less likely willing to trade within these places. The alternative on how you're able to trade with Africa doesn't work. But even if it is true that you're able to trade with Africa, we think it's particularly less sustainable. Why do we think this is true? Africa in and of itself is developing. Most of these countries do not even have the capacity. What that means, you're not even able to trade at the prices you would necessarily want. We think that's bad for these guys. We think necessarily that's not a good thing. Why then do we win this debate? A, opening half argues a lot about democracy and autocracy. Why this motion was particularly set by CAP, we think it's because of the economic benefits or economic disparities that necessarily exist within these places. Why are we able to fulfill this and on OG? Think A, we pulling out exposes these countries to economic shocks. If the situation is now, we think you make the situation worse on that side of the house. Why pulling out is going to be sustainable for you in terms of the economy, that sort of thing. We think that's very, very important for these countries because in terms of proximity of needs, we think these countries are more likely going to buy into the idea of getting economic emancipation as opposed to having democracy and that sort of thing. I think economy and better standards of living are very important for these countries. Ever been proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Calling on the member of opposition to open the case for the closing opposition.
from closing opposition to add to what's been discussed so far. The first is that global socio-economic and political trends are towards nationalism because regional blocs in of themselves have failed individuals. Brexit is an example that opening opposition gives you. This means individuals want to be able to self-determine as directly as possible. The second is the political evolution among the states that are going to be forming the Sahel region is something that needs to be considered. The coup happening wasn't simply because the military decided it's kind of cool to militarize without any kind of practical incentive. It was because the citizens actively wanted it. Evidence of this is the citizens actually supporting the coup happening, coming out and chatting that Wagner is the way forward, and this is something that has to be put into consideration. So we are talking of freedom and listening to the desires of the people. We think that this is something that's highly consistent with them. We think A, citizens of these countries demonstrated anywhere and in support of Russia. That's something that's important. But two, the governments of Sahel, because the biggest push from government so far is that these things are going to outrightly turn into autocracies and going to oppress people. But it's inconsistent. They claim that everyone around you is rooting for you to fail. What is the incentive for the Sahel government to be formed to then oppress its citizens if that's going to give an incentive for Nigeria to invade as directly as possible, for France to say, look, we're saving people, and for America that's always willing to sell democracy, say, the citizens were complaining, you saw them being oppressed, we came in to help them. We think the fact that they're existing in a land where everyone seems to be an enemy to them is reason enough for them to not turn oppressive to their citizens because it gives everyone legitimacy to attack them. We think in this instance, it will become legitimate for them to be attacked on grounds of being oppressive to their own citizens. There are two alternatives of what the world becomes for these nations that are already out of ECOWAS and on their own terms. The first is that they can return to ECOWAS, or in the instance where ECOWAS affords protection, what becomes of them? We say the present harms that we're going to discuss shortly afterwards, there's little incentive for ECOWAS to improve, maybe to listen to them significantly more, as opening opposition tells you, or for them to not flood local markets with good from surrounding stronger economies. But B, this I think becomes the crucial part, remaining smaller independent states, because the alternative of forming the Sahel region is that Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, and Niger remain as independent and smaller states. We say a couple of things from closing opposition. One, these companies have weak institutions of governance. That's why the Kati camp was able to come out to Mali and say the government and the president is out, because the governments were corrupt and flat and just really, really bad. But B, there are weak economies with currencies linked to things like the francs. That means France, for example, has a large discussion on things like the foreign reserves you're able to have, having them in francs as opposed to having them in the dollar. We think that this is something that's crucial. But B, there's more weak states close to each other. In this instance, we believe on principle they should be able to leverage on the weaknesses they have. It means things like they say, for example, that these countries are landlocked, that they're not going to be able to sell their goods to anyone. We say from closing opposition that because they produce similar goods as said, they're able to then decide the bargaining power. They're able to collectivize and sell these goods at significantly higher prices, something that they don't get to do in status quo simply because they have fragmented bargaining power. But B, they have to be beholden to the general principles of ECOWAS, which are largely utilitarian, of what is in the best interest for the region. We think utilitarianism has failed these people. But here's a controversial argument. One, we think that the existence in ECOWAS has harmed ECOWAS. A, we say these countries, as said by OG, are dependent economically on most of these countries. For example, the bigger economies within ECOWAS have to do things like helping them out economically because of mutually assured destruction. Because if Mali fails, if Niger fails, for example, the impact of it is that something that has to be felt by all of us. This means to a large extent that ECOWAS has to consistently pander to the failing economies of most of these smaller countries that have not industrialized to a large degree. This means ECOWAS spends a lot amount of money to actually sustain these countries that are already weak and failing, and quite frankly, a parasite to ECOWAS as an institution. We say because of things like mutually assured destruction, ECOWAS has consistently extended help that has not allowed them to self-develop or actually help themselves in any way. We say in this instance, ECOWAS, with collective good for the region, has consistently prioritized their problems. If that's the best case for these guys, when they say ECOWAS listens to these people, this is something that is significantly bad. But see, ECOWAS struggles to protect these countries. They say ISIS, Bamako, and whatnot are consistent problems. We say from closing opposition, that's good. Well, they come out and actually express their allyship with Wagner Group from Russia. This means they can get the protection that they need without ECOWAS having to spend large amounts of money in ensuring their protection. Because if these countries are not protected largely, then it becomes problematic for the region. We say the amount of money they spend anyway sustaining countries that are weak without any kind of economic benefit to this group is something that is bad. But most importantly here, smaller and niche issues that are specific to these countries are consistent
constantly trading off, because the decision-making calculus of regional blocks is what is good for the region, how can we actually grow as a region, not how do you grow as smaller countries. This means qualms on things such as, oh, we have a weak currency, our currency is being externally controlled, are consistently traded off, because not an issue that's affecting Ghana or Nigeria, so it's consistently something that's probably not considered with the most impact. But B, that disgruntled citizens within these countries cause tensions and instabilities within the region. For example, when people in Mali are able to, or Chad are able to complain that Sudanese are influxing into their countries because of the kind of instability that exists in their country, this means ECOWAS has to formulate a policy that helps them. But this is not an issue that's affecting everyone. It's affecting small countries that economically are already draining you and they're not helping you to the most part. So we say in this instance, it causes many of these individuals are influxing into larger countries like Nigeria and Ghana. So things rates of employment, for example, are things that get significantly worse. So this is not a benefit to these bigger countries or to ECOWAS as a whole. This is something that they need to solve on their own, because those issues, quite frankly, are too bad. Rest. Economically beneficial to these countries. There are a number of things under this. A, influx of foreigners from neighboring countries that have better education because they have better economic system. So quite frankly, they're better equipped to deal with these issues. This means the small, can you sit down, please? So this means the smaller benefits the local employed people would have been able to benefit from are taken from them. So you have consistently foreigners coming into your small country who speak English and you only speak French. So any multinational corporations within your country are likely to employ them. So you take away the little employment that they were already likely to have, causing more disgruntled citizens. But the local markets are flooded with goods from neighboring countries. Countries like Burkina Faso recently started industrializing and producing their own goods. When they were in ECOWAS, for example, goods from places like Ghana and Nigeria consistently flooded their local markets. This means even if local companies come up anyway, they're not going to survive because they're consistently going to be outcompeted, because most of the goods you get from them are tariff-free. But B, the free flow movement within ECOWAS means any individual can come into your country and establish some kind of economic dominance that you have little ways of enjoying. So in this instance, we say we incentivize them to actually industrialize when they become an independent bloc that allows them to make decisions. But lastly, on principle here, we say impaired ability to self-determine. We've shown you on various practical levels where this is something that is bad. But in many instances, they've consistently been required to trade off things like their personal agency, the goals for the country, all in favor of what ECOWAS wants. We think when collectivizing as a region, because of things like the coups having happened in most of these countries, that the alignment in terms of what regional power do we want to align with becomes significantly important in allowing them to self-determine. They're happy to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We call on the government, we close on the government of it.
Okay, assuming I'm eligible, shout out to Nika. She got me this far and hopefully I take her further. Shout out to the current Smart Core extension and shout out to everybody in the semis. It's fun to have you guys. Shout out to our panel. So I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll just start by proving why our extensions are far much better than what opening government see. Opening government tells you that you're more repressive to people because you do not have trade capacities, and that's the extent of their argument. Here's our extension. What Nika tells you is that we have a protectionism mechanism that gets to exist within ECOWAS countries, which generally then means within these regions, we want to actively protect the people that get to exist within them. We think then repressive mechanisms are far much worse when it comes to lack of security capacities that get to exist within these regions, which automatically then means security becomes logically prior to economic benefits, based off of the premise that you cannot achieve economic benefits without the capacity for you to protect yourself as a region, and I think that's very, very important. The second thing you
get from Nika is that the disenfranchisement of these particular people that get to exist within this region is far much worse, because the idea is that they already have maximum internal fights that get to exist within them and they have no capacity to actualize. What this then means is that if there's a capacity for it to get worse, then you lose the debate, which means opposition in general cannot win this debate based off of the fact that A, they not actively benefit these states, and we think this is important. Let's start with CO in regards to the extension within this debate. They argue A, they want to benefit ECOWAS as a whole and things like that. If I get to prove to you that ECOWAS in and of itself gets to maximally being harmed based off of the idea of these countries pulling out, then I guess we win this debate based off of that premise. They tell you that these ECOWAS countries will now not have weak countries existing within them. This is a flawed analysis that they get to give you, because the idea is that the funding and the trade opportunities that you get as ECOWAS as a region is based off of the premise that all of these countries get to exist within you, because the idea is that the developed states are directly incentivized to help developing countries on a general scope or on like things like that, which automatically then means they want an organization that is formed that will act particularly benefit a large majority of group of people, which is why they get to invest in these regions, which automatically then means if countries get to pull out from you, there's no incentive for these people to actively benefit you financially, so ECOWAS automatically falls. CO cannot win the debate based off of that premise. But even extensively, they can argue and come and say that, oh, fine, they're going to invest in Sahel. Here's why this is most likely not going to happen. We already proved to you that the Sahel region is like incapacitated with like internal fights and things like that. It's destabilized, which automatically then means there's a lower likelihood for them to alternatively now invest in the speaker states based off of the premise that they're already having internal fights, they're not stabilized, and that cannot be an argument that they get to make within this debate. And I think we beat them most of that premise and things like that. Then finally, they argue that, oh, authoritarianism is going to benefit this particular people because the global world is actively watching them, and all of a sudden there's a mechanism to stop the idea of you being oppressive in nature. Recognize the frame is that human beings cling to power. Human beings are capitalistic in nature. Human beings want to self-preserve and want to actively protect them, which automatically then means regardless of the world actively watching you, you want to protect yourself. The direct intuition ground for this is when Sudan was actively fighting to get like this particular idea of independence, they're now fighting further because they cannot agree on who gets to maintain power. The intuition problem is very simple, which automatically then means there's a high likelihood for oppression continuously existing within authoritarianism. These guys cannot come and say that, oh, because the world is watching you, all of a sudden you get sovereignty. That's a horrible argument. Opening opposition then. Opening opposition argue imperialism exists within ECOWAS, and that's a bad thing. And then they tell you the alternative is Russia and China. Guys, you cannot argue imperialism on ECOWAS, then feel all of a sudden because Russia and China exist, there's not going to be like imperialism on that particular spectrum. That's a horrible argument as a whole. Then they say there's a propaganda that has been created that democracies are bad. It's not a propaganda if there's already an incentive for why this particular people or authoritarianism as a whole has not benefited a large group of people. Then they single out one country. With them, it's going to work within this particular developing states. The frame is very simple. They are developing states as a whole. The idea then becomes, if they are developing, the direct incentive is development as a whole, which automatically then means if you cannot prove development for these particular countries, you lose out of the debate, and your frame does not prove why all of a sudden they're going to develop and get to actually have like this sovereignty as a whole. That's a horrible argument to make as a whole. Then also, they tell you there's going to be instability if these countries continue existing within ECOWAS because they're directly going against like the West and things like that. The idea is pretty simple. If you say they're going to be unstable, if they actually stay within ECOWAS, and we prove to you instability is going to be far much worse when they like pull out, then it's going to be like a horrible way to make that argument. And here's why this is true. The idea then becomes, if majority of these people are going to be more polarized, today they can agree and say, fine, we don't want France and things like that, we agree with you. But then, when these citizens do not get direct benefit from the idea of you separating yourself from this particular ECOWAS as a whole, the idea then becomes they're going to backlash against you as a government because you cannot actively protect the citizens as a whole, which automatically then means instability is further exacerbated on the side of these particular people where citizens no longer even trust authoritarianism as a whole. We don't see why then citizens are going to all sit down and say, oh well, it didn't work, we're going to sit and be fine. We think that's a horrible argument to make as a whole. Now on way, right?
Okay. The currencies they have in status will make it difficult for anyone to want to trade with them. But the proven to you are economically and security-wise, they get benefited, something that ECOWAS doesn't provide.
Okay, they say that currencies are currently going to disenfranchisement from making money, right? What we tell you with Nika is that the idea of Brexit was very simple. Immediately UK left, they devalued their currency. Secondly, they devalued their capacity to actively trade with the people that get get to exist within them. Then thirdly, they were now desperate for the idea of like them actually developing and things like that, which automatically then means if it has developed countries, it's going to be worse for developing countries, far much worse. And these guys say, they tell you where security benefits are going to exist for these particular regions as a whole. We don't think that's a proper argument to make, because the idea is that there's a lot of polarization that's existing on a global spectrum. The polarization then that gets to exist, it means that majority of these people are choosing to form allyships and things like that. In the instance that now you're pulling out from a possible ally for you to be actively protected from the active polarization that's existing on a global spectrum, we think this is going to be really, really bad for you, and we think that's important. On weighing them, we think the idea of like how you faster get development is far much better on our side, because the most proximate need for these developing countries is to achieve development. On their side, now you have to start from scratch and get to find a way to develop yourself. That's a horrible thing for these developing states, because that's their most proximate need. We think that on our side, we get to prove to you why development is most likely based on proximity to like economic benefits, and at the same time security benefits as a whole. But even finally, people are not directly targeting you because of the polarization that gets to exist. On scope of impact then, we think we get to impact these developing states on a far much greater level. These guys say you want to have sovereignty to make decisions for yourself, but then they argue that you want to trade with other African countries. Our response is very simple. You won't have trade opportunities, you'll be actively targeted, you'll have internal fights. Sovereignty doesn't exist, ability to make choices for yourself doesn't exist, but even if you have choices to make for yourself, you still don't get to develop. What choice without having to develop and to actually stand for yourself? We don't think choice can be an argument in this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. We call on the opposition to close out the debate here.
Okay, just raise your hand if you have any POIs. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the important thing about what you get from Becky is that we expand the debate, and I think it's unfortunate that Mercy chose to ignore that for a couple of reasons. First, we respond better than opening to a lot of what you get from opening government. In that, even if democracy is something that's good, ECOWAS doesn't provide any solvency. Because all their diplomatic threats, all their threats of like imposing the military didn't necessarily mean that these people were restored into democracy. So even if it's something that's valuable, it's not a benefit that ECOWAS is able to provide them. But secondly, she gives you unique framing about these countries economically, that they have the same economic interests because they are small and are just struggling within the bloc, but they also have similar political interests in that they are like pushing against democracy and the governments that they have in those particular states and just want support more from Russia and the Wagner Group and stuff like that. So that makes them similar entities. I think closing using the example of Brexit is just ridiculous in the context of the framing you get from Becky, because the reason why Brexit happened was because they felt they were too powerful and they were getting more, they were giving up more than they were receiving. So ignoring the framing you get from Becky in that these countries are small and they're just disenfranchised within this specific bloc is like bad for closing. The third thing you get from her is the reason why this would be bad for ECOWAS, because it means they are going to be carrying a weight that makes the bloc like generally weaker. You have to provide economic support to a lot of these smaller countries because the failure of the country as a whole is going to affect the bloc. You have to like proffer some level of military support because of all the conflict you get from closing in this debate. The other thing is the empty threats and why that looks bad. Because note, like ECOWAS hasn't been able to intervene militarily despite threatening places like Niger. So you just look bad, like someone who doesn't have power or just can't do the things that you're supposed to do. I think the impact of that extends even beyond these smaller countries because now even the bigger powerful countries existing within ECOWAS find it to be irrelevant. I think that's bad. Direct responses to what we get from opening. The first thing they say is that democracy is valuable in these states. I agree, this should not be a conversation about like governance, but we'll show you why we give better responses than our opening that ignores a lot of these analysis. The first thing Becky tells you is that the pillar of democracy is choice. Insofar as we are able to prove that a lot of the people existing within these countries chose to push out their governments, then this becomes something that's valuable. You can't impose something on our populace because some white people thought it's perfect, insofar as this populace
populace believes they want to push out that government. This, like, she gives you an example of Niger and how they were protesting in the streets against wanting to take out the government. The second thing to note is that ECOWAS is heavily controlled by France. I think it's unfair for them to say we don't want this to be a debate about France. It's why there was a lot of like clapback against like these states that were pushing out their government and stuff like that. We think restoration of choice in our side of the world is valuable. Fine, you might say that every state is bad, like Russia, China, they are all horrible. But at least there's some level of choice that otherwise doesn't exist in their side of the world, especially because ECOWAS is imposing decisions on them. I think that's something that's not valuable. Additionally, we think it's just going to result in like the amount of safety that like OG says is something that's significant, and that their closing pushes are something that should be a priori to any economic benefits. Insofar as we're able to prove like people like Wagner Group are able to like deploy military in these places to cater for things like terrorism and stuff like that, and all the instability, like ECOWAS hasn't been able to like proffer military support to this country. So things like protection and stability that they seem to be considered the most important thing in the debate aren't provided by ECOWAS. So it's just irrelevant. But even if that's not true, the threats by ECOWAS do nothing to restore democracy. Them threatening to have diplomatic discussions and them threatening to like move the military into these places has not resulted in the like restoration of democracy. So even if democracy is valuable, ECOWAS isn't ensuring it's something that exists with the status quo, so they are just irrelevant. The other thing they say is that trade is going to exist and this is going to result in having better lives. I don't think this is true, especially because of what you get from Becky. It's not good for these smaller states in terms of trade. This is because they are smaller economies and like are obviously beholden to the bigger economies existing within ECOWAS. But secondly, this means they lose a lot of bargaining power. So you can't do things like control the prices of things like being traded within that like block, and this is something that's bad. So it's not true that they have like trade abilities that will allow them to like get enough like benefit from ECOWAS. The second thing is like they will do better in our side of the world, because even if we agree with their analysis that these countries like produce similar goods, we think it's far much better if they are existing together, because then they have the ability to collude and, for example, have like similar prices, which gives them a lot more bargaining power as a bloc, as the Sahel, than they otherwise would have. If you're producing the same goods, you collude to sell it at a high price. This is just far much more beneficial than them existing as independent smaller countries that just can't compete at the economic scale of other bigger countries within the bloc. The third thing to note is the ease of things like the ease of movement of things like goods and stuff like that, and like people are things that are bad for these economies. Because fine, people will be able to move in and out of these countries, but it's going to disadvantage these smaller economies. This is because the more powerful countries then have undue control. They have people moving out of the smaller countries into the bigger countries, meaning now they lose like the sort of like labor force they would have within their countries and stuff like that. The goods from larger countries that Becky tells you are likely to be of much are likely to be much cheaper, because those economies just have larger economies of scale. Like you're not able to compete with them, so you're not able to get any like benefit from trading at the end of the day. The last thing here is that it's just bad for ECOWAS, because we are able to prove that these smaller countries just become far much weaker the more they exist within ECOWAS. ECOWAS is then burdened to keep like alleviating these people out of the situation within which they exist, so it's just bad even for the bigger states.
The counterfactual of Russia is currently fighting more intensively with Ukraine and NATO. That's why they're only facing Wagner. You cannot see out Russia's efficiency without discovering that Wagner is involved in the complete act of for that is war.
It's private, meaning it's detached from the Russian government. Whatever the Russian government is doing doesn't affect the private entity. They can still provide like the protection they need to do within those places. In terms of closing, first, the analysis around price volatility and economic shocks, this doesn't make sense. They pick up economic principles and try to bring them into this debate. I think there's very little analysis there. But a couple of responses here. First, we think why would economic shocks caused by things like global problems affect like only the Sahel region and not like the general ECOWAS bloc? Like it just doesn't make sense there. But secondly, these are smaller countries. Meaning in moments of economic crisis, the bigger countries aren't going to be giving them money. Those countries are going to be channeling money back into their own states. So it doesn't provide any benefit to these small states anyway. But secondly, we think they are small, so they are less likely to access things like the funds that Becky tells you about. So trade for them just becomes something that's like a lot more difficult. The comparative is they can collude and have higher prices, which is good for them economically. The other thing they say is that these states are different. It's unclear to me why, if they're different economically and politically, we want them to exist within the same bloc. That probably means they're never going to have agreement, they're never going to be on the same page. The polarization and fragmentation they talk about that will exist within ECOWAS is just exacerbation if you force these people to exist within ECOWAS. That's bad for ECOWAS and it's bad for these smaller countries. Proud to.
Thank you very much for that.